started picking on me. By day 2, I had had more than enough, and so I went and I told the teacher. And she didn't do anything about it. Which, yeah, I know teachers in here would handle things completely different. But because she didn't do anything about it, this empowered them to do more. They said, well, the teacher doesn't care, so let's really give it to him. And so at lunch that day, they cornered me at some place on the schoolyard, and they really launched into me. Really calling me names, making jokes at my expense, laughing at me. I wanted to get away, but I couldn't. I was outnumbered. I needed someone to come, someone to help me, someone to stand up for me, to help even the playing field, help me get away. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of my best friends walking towards us. We had gone to school, kindergarten together, first grade together, second grade together, and here we are in third grade together. And we had gone to each other's birthday parties. We had spent time at each other's houses and with each other's families. And I knew if anyone was going to come and stand up for me and give me the help I needed, it was going to be my friend. And sure enough, as he saw what was happening, he stopped. But he didn't speak out in my defense. In fact, he started laughing with them. And after a couple minutes, a minute or two, he actually joined in with the teasing and the name-calling. And to have someone, my friend, who I thought out of anyone would have my back, would stand up for me, would speak out on my behalf. To have my friend start calling me names, start laughing at me, was 10 times worse than whatever these bullies were doing. Have you ever found yourself in need of help? Have you ever found yourself in a place where you just needed someone to stand up for you? Maybe as a child, you experienced abuse, and you just needed that one family member to come to your defense. Maybe at work, you've been falsely accused of doing something, and you just needed that one coworker to be on your side. Maybe you've experienced discrimination because of your age, or your race, or your gender, or your religious beliefs. And you just wish that there was someone that you could go to that would give you the support, that would give you the comfort that you needed, that would stand up for you. I think that we've all been at places in our lives where we've needed someone, where we've needed someone to be on our side, where we've needed someone to reach out and help us. So I think perhaps the more central question is, have we always been the person to stand up for those in need? We've all needed help, but have we always been a person that has offered to stand up for the person that is being outnumbered, that is underpowered, that is in need of help? I would like to say that because of my experience in third grade, that I always stood up for those that were being bullied, that I always stood up for those that were being overpowered. And to be fair, the vast majority of the time I did. But I do remember a few times where I joined in with the laughing. I joined in with the majority. In fact, I remember one or two times where I actually started the teasing and the joking and the ridicule. Because there's this strong power, there's this draw that we all experience to be part of the powerful majority. We all want to be in the bigger group. None of us like being outnumbered. None of us like being in the group that has the least amount of power. Society has been constructed in a way where we all feel that yearning and that pull to be part of the powerful majority. And yet so often that comes at the expense of others. Us being part of the powerful majority frequently comes on the backs of the underpowered minority. And we see this because this is how society operates. This is how the world works. And we see example after example of this in our own country and in our own society, in the history of our nation, and in the current status of our society. We see it way back when the colonies were first established. Many Catholic immigrants came to the American colonies and hid their faith because of prejudice and discrimination. These colonies that had been established in large part by people that were fleeing religious persecution, religious discrimination in Europe, once they came to America, once they established these colonies, once they became the majority, once they got a taste of having the power, they in turn began to discriminate against the outnumbered and the underpowered. And we see how this religious discrimination has never fully gone away in our society. After 9/11, Islamophobia skyrocketed. This most recent anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks, just a few weeks ago, on September 12th, social media, if you were paying attention, was filled with stories, mainly from people who had been children at this time, sharing their memories of how their parents shaved their beards, removed their turbans, changed their clothes, changed their names, changed the names of their children because of the abuse, verbal and physical abuse, that they were receiving in the aftermath of these attacks. People that had no connection to these horrific terrorist attacks, people that were as repulsed and abhorred by these September 11 attacks as anyone else was. They were the recipients of abuse after abuse because they were in the minority. In fact, a recent study done by the Pew Research Center just came out a few months ago. It shows that 82% of Americans recognize that there is at least some discrimination against Muslims, with a percentage in the high 60s saying that there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims. And 64% of Americans recognize that there is at least some discrimination against Jews. And that's just a couple of the statistics here. We know, we understand, we recognize that there are religious minorities, that there are religious people that are outnumbered in our society that receive abuse and discrimination because they are in the minority. But it's not just religious people that receive this, that receive abuse for being outnumbered. Our country has a history of horrific racism. Slavery was not abolished in our country until 1865, and black men could not vote until 1870 because they were seen as subhuman by many people in power. They were seen as maybe a step above animals, but a step or five below normal, fully developed human beings. They were a subhuman group. And so we hear story after story of abuse and abuse throughout the intervening centuries and years. But in fact, the truth is, black people are still treated as less than human by many people in power still today. We hear stories on the news almost daily of occurrences where black people or other races with darker skin color face discrimination, face abuse. Just a few statistics here from some recent research. Just looking at the criminal justice system. It says that African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 32% of the population, yet they comprise 56% of all incarcerated people. They said if minorities were jailed at the same rate as white people, that the prison population would drop by 40%. Also, research has shown, very recent research has shown, that a black man is 2.5 times more likely than a white man to be killed by the police, and 2 times more likely to be unarmed when he is killed by the police. This is not saying at all that black people or Hispanic people or any minorities have a more criminal intent or bent than white people. It's showing that the perception and the way we enact a lot of our criminal justice is geared toward this underlying conception that has been rooted in our history of seeing and viewing black people and minorities as second-class or third-class citizens. And it's not just men, or not just minorities, rather. Women themselves have found themselves to be not necessarily outnumbered because they make about 50% of the population, but historically they have been vastly underpowered when it comes to the power that men typically enjoy. Women could not vote until 1920 because women's votes cannot accomplish more than men's votes. So it's a waste of time, energy, and money. Women have for so long been seen simply as extensions of either their fathers or their husbands, so that when they were trying to get the push for them to vote, they said, no, they're just gonna be a second vote for their fathers, or it's gonna be a second vote for their husbands, because they're women, they don't have the abilities or the comprehension to vote on their own. They are seen, again, as a second-class citizen. And if you remember from a couple slides ago, black men were given the right to vote in 1870. So despite our deeply entrenched history of racism in the country, even we understood, the politicians understood, had the mindset that black men could vote, and gave them the right to vote 50 years before they thought women could vote properly. And we see this still play out in society today. Women are still treated unequally. Time and time again, we hear story after example of women being treated differently than men. Some studies, mostly done by the government, have shown, give some examples of gender inequality. The average earnings of all women who work full-time year-round is 80.5% of men who work full-time year-round. And the gap is worse for black and Hispanic women. That there's about 20% gap between what men earn and what women earn. Retired women are 2 times more likely than retired men to live below the poverty line. Nearly 1 in 5 women versus 1 in 38 men have experienced completed or attempted rape in their lives. And I believe a study was just released this week that said that about 1 out of every 15 women, when it came that rape was their first sexual experience. 1 out of 15 women. We see time and time again, women are not treated in the same category as men. And these are just 3 examples of 3 categories of people that experience discrimination, that experience abuse at the hands of the majority, at the hands of those who are in power. We could list several more, but I think you get the picture, you get the idea of how our society is set up. And this causes problems on a variety of levels. To know that there are people in this world, there are people in our society, there are people in our city, perhaps there are even people in this church this morning that are viewed and treated differently than they should be. They are valued less than they should be. They are valued less by people, by others, maybe even by us, than they are valued by God. See, the truth is, this morning, and the truth is that we're learning throughout this whole series, is that when we learn to see things through God's eyes, humanity becomes much more connected than we first realized. It's easy for us to to dismiss other people from other groups and saying, oh, I'm not like them. I don't have that experience that they do, and it's no big deal. I'm just going to focus on my own life and my own experiences. But God is saying, no, you can't do that. You can't go through life dismissing what other people are doing, what other people are saying, what other people are experiencing, because they are connected to you. That it's not just them and us, or us and them. It's everyone together is in this. And we can't be dismissive. See, sometimes if you are like most people, the statistics that we've just covered, you might think, yeah, those are bad statistics. Those are really bad statistics. But they don't really impact me much. Like I treat Muslims and Jews and Catholics well. I have a couple of black friends and a couple of Hispanic friends. I treat women with respect. And so these shameful statistics, that's on other people, not on me. And again, that's a very understandable mentality, because that is the typical mindset of good people, but good people who happen to be in the majority. Of good people who have the capability of saying, that doesn't really affect me, because I am in the group with the power. Because I am in the group that isn't outnumbered, but is the majority. And yet this is the exact opposite of the mindset that God wants us to have. This is the mindset that God addresses in the book of Obadiah. Obadiah is a minor prophet, and again, just to ingrain it in deeper, a minor prophet doesn't mean they're less important than the major prophets. It just means that they wrote less. Their books are shorter. And Obadiah, his name means worshiper of Yahweh. But in fact, some scholars think that is more of a general title than a proper name. That we see that phrase repeated frequently throughout the Old Testament, and because pretty much any prophet, any servant of God should be a worshiper of Yahweh. And so there's some debate whether or not it's an actual name or a title, but it could very well be a proper name. They believe that Obadiah was written between 586 and 553 BCE, but it's more of an educated guess than anything. It's almost a shot in the dark, because it's very difficult to really pin down when this book was written, because there's no identifying marks in it. There's no verse that says this person was the king, or this natural disaster happened. So there's the typical way that people date books in the Bible aren't found here in Obadiah. And perhaps he just didn't have the time to do it, because this is the shortest book in the entire Old Testament. It's only one chapter long. So, we're not going to cover the whole chapter, so you can go home and finish the whole chapter today, in a matter of a minute or two. But it was written in Judah, and yet Obadiah has a message for Edom. Last week we looked at Amos, who was from the southern kingdom of Judah. By that time, Israel had split into two kingdoms, and so even though he was from the southern kingdom of Judah, went to minister to the northern kingdom of Israel. This time we find Obadiah from the southern kingdom of Judah, but bringing his prophetic message to the people of Edom. But who are the people of Edom, right? Anyone know who Edom is? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back a little bit in biblical history. For those of us that are familiar with some of the major Bible stories, we'll remember the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were the twin grandsons of Abraham. Jacob was the secondborn, Esau was the firstborn. And so that entitled Esau to the birthright, which meant he would get the better blessings from his father Isaac, that he would get the more inheritance from his father Isaac. But Jacob didn't want that to happen. And so through some trickery and some deception, he took the birthright for himself. Now, if you ever had a sibling steal something from you, which I haven't, I'm an only child, so if you have had that happen, though, you know that can cause some bad feelings, right? Some drama, some family tension. And in fact, Jacob was so in trouble that he fled for his life to another part of the country. Well, long story short, he came back home eventually and was reconciled to his brother Esau. But eventually they split again, this time on much better terms. Genesis 36, verses 6 to 8 talk about this split. And it says, Esau took his family and all the wealth he had acquired in the land of Canaan and moved away from his brother Jacob. There was not enough land to support them both because of all the livestock and possessions they had acquired. They were so rich they needed to split up. So Esau, also known as Edom, settled in the hill country of Seir. So we know that Jacob, whose name later became Israel, became the father of the Israelites. And Esau, whose name became Edom, became the father of the Edomites. And so the Israelites and the Edomites, they were related. They were from the same family tree. They were all descendants of Abraham. And so Obadiah comes on the scene, and he's a descendant of Jacob, but he brings a prophetic message of destruction to the descendants of Esau. He comes and he announces the fact that God is going to destroy his relatives. Why does God say destruction is coming? Well, we find this in verse 2. The Lord says to Edom, I will cut you down to size among the nations. You will be greatly despised. You have been deceived by your own pride because you live in a rock fortress and make your home high in the mountains. Who can ever reach us up, way up here, you ask boastfully? But I will bring you crashing down, says the Lord. God says, Edom, you've messed up. You're in trouble. I am going to destroy you. Even though you have a fortress, though you live in houses that are built high into the mountains, you are going to be destroyed. Now, what fortress is God talking about? What high mountain village is God referring to? Well, many scholars think that they've identified it. In fact, it's a place that Crystal and I had the chance to visit a couple years ago. And perhaps some of you have been there, and I would imagine most of you have at least seen this place before, particularly in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Many scholars believe that what God is talking about here through Obadiah is the city of Petra. This is the famous building of Petra that you see as you go down this winding, narrow canyon road. It opens up and you see this red rock structure carved into the face of the mountain. This is called Treasury, and it's a facade. It doesn't really go back that deep. There's no palace behind it, really. And in fact, the Treasury was built, they say were constructed by the Nabateans, not the Edomites, several hundred years after the Edomites were on the scene of history. But as you continue down the path past the Treasury, you come across dwellings. The old ones were simple caves there put into the side of the mountain. And then you can go up further and higher and see that there's more buildings, more constructions up along the mountainside. And this is where many scholars believe the Edomites lived. This was one of their major fortified cities. In fact, they say that because of the narrow, winding path, that 12 defenders could actually push away an army of 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers. So this was a very well-fortified city, a very well-defended city, cities where people dwelled high up in the mountains. And yet God says, you're going to be destroyed. It's all coming down. Why? Verse 5 says, if thieves came at night and robbed you, what a disaster awaits you. They would not take everything. Those who harvest grapes always leave a few for the poor, but your enemies will wipe you out completely. Every nook and cranny of Edom will be searched and looted. Every treasure will be found and taken. Total destruction. Can you imagine coming home one night and finding that your house had been robbed? But the thieves didn't just take your TV and your computers and your laptop or your tablets. They didn't just take your valuables and your electronics. They took everything. They took your couch. They took your boxes of cereal. They even took your toilet paper. This is what God is saying is going to happen to the Edomites. There's going to be nothing left. And verse 10 begins to give the answer. Because, God says, of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel, you will be filled with shame and destroyed forever. Because of what you did to your cousins, the Israelites, it's curtains for you. So what did they do? Verse 11 continues. It says, when the Israelites were invaded, you stood aloof, refusing to help them. Foreign invaders carried off their wealth and cast lots to divide up Jerusalem, but you acted like one of Israel's enemies. God says the first reason at the top of the list why you are going to be destroyed is because when Israel was in trouble, you stood back and did nothing. When Israel was outnumbered and needed your help, you didn't speak up. You didn't stand up. You simply stood there and watched the destruction take place. Reminds me of the famous quote by Martin Luther King Jr., which says, for evil to succeed, all it needs is for good men to do nothing. And this is what we see is at the top of the list that the Edomites did. They did nothing. But the verse continues. Eventually, that standing aloof got a little boring, and they started to become actively involved, as we read in verses 12 to 13. God says, you should not have gloated. You should not have rejoiced. You should not have spoken arrogantly. You should not have plundered the land of Israel. You should not have seized their wealth when they were suffering such calamity. Because eventually it got to the point where the Edomites saw how outnumbered the Israelites were, when they saw how much in trouble they were, that instead of just standing back and seeing which way the wind blew, they said, all right, they're in trouble and now we can profit off of their trouble. And this is what often happens. This is what usually happens when the outnumbered get taken advantage of by the powerful majority. The powerful majority profits either directly or indirectly off of the outnumbered and underpowered. As men, we might think, I hope women get equal rights, and I hope they get equal pay, and I'm an advocate for women. But in the meantime, we enjoy that 20% bump in our paycheck. We reap some of the benefits indirectly of the fact that the underpowered are not viewed and treated equally. Perhaps a more prime example in our history is that during World War II, after the nation of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, all of the Japanese American citizens were rounded up and sent to internment camps. They were only allowed to take what they could carry with them. And this meant that they had to leave their homes and their furniture and their cars and their businesses all behind. And guess what happened? The people in power, the majority, took them. And this means that economists have estimated that there was an economic loss between $1 to $3 billion, not adjusted for inflation, that was taken from these Japanese American citizens when they were forced into internment camps. The powerful majority profited from the way the outnumbered and underpowered were treated. The message in Obadiah doesn't stop there, though. Verse 14 says this, that you should not have stood at the crossroads, killing those who tried to escape. You should not have captured the survivors and handed them over in their terrible time of trouble. Because apparently the Edomites went from standing aloof to profiting from Israel's destruction to becoming actively engaged in their death. And that happens in our society. That happens with us, I think, far too often, far more than we would like to admit. There are times as a member of the majority where we just stay silent. There are times as member of the powerful group that we profit from the abuse of those that are outnumbered. And yet there are also times where we, in the powerful majority, are actively engaged in life-stealing oppression of those that are in need. We see this. We see examples of this, of good Christians that have been members and leaders of organizations like the KKK. We see this in the stories of good Christians that have gone to mosques and shot Muslims as they worshiped. We see examples of this from good Christians, even pastors, who have perpetrated acts of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Perhaps the story that strikes closest to home for many of us is the story of Lucy Byard. Lucy, the story takes place in 1955, not all that long ago. Lucy was a black Seventh-day Adventist living in New York. She was diagnosed with liver cancer. And along with liver cancer came a disease called cachexia, which other people can get. It's just a wasting away of your body. And because Lucy was a Seventh-day Adventist, she wanted to be treated at a Seventh-day Adventist hospital. So she and her husband went to their pastor, Elder Jeter Cox, and asked him to write a letter of introduction, a recommendation letter for them to be admitted to the Washington Seventh-day Adventist Sanitarium in the Washington, D.C. area. The Washington Sanitarium got their letter and responded favorably and sent an invitation for Lucy Byard to come down to be admitted. She arrived. She and her husband made the journey and arrived at the hospital, showed them the letter. They took her to the ward that she needed to be at, gave her a bed, but her stay was short-lived, because the hospital administrators soon found out that Lucy was black. And so they quickly unadmitted her. They simply said, "Sorry, you have to go." And they put her on a bus, because their policy was to not admit people of color. Here was an Adventist woman going to an Adventist hospital and yet being rejected because she was black. And a short time later, she died. All because the people in power thought that it was okay to deny help to someone who was outnumbered, who was underpowered, who was in the minority. Thankfully, things have changed since 1955. And yet, as we look at society, things have not changed enough. I look at our church, and I love our church because we have a very diverse church. And yet there are churches across this nation where the worship hour is perhaps still the most segregated hour in our country. I have a personal story in my family. One of my cousins from my dad's generation, she married an African American man. They went to show up to worship at a white church one Sabbath morning, and the greeter out front said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but the black church is actually a few blocks down and to the left." People in the majority like to be in the majority. They like to experience the power that comes with being in the majority. And yet, Christ tells us that's not the way it's supposed to be. When we learn to see things through God's eyes, humanity becomes much more connected than we first realize. Instead of rejecting people and sending people away, we are called to welcome them, and to treat them and to help them and to stand up for them and to speak out on their behalf. This is the call of the gospel. This is the call of Obadiah. This is the call of God. But I know we might be thinking, well, what can I do? What can little old me do to stand up against these forces of bigotry and racial discrimination and gender discrimination and religious discrimination? What can I do? Well, it all starts with listening to this call from the story of Obadiah to speak out and stand instead of standing aloof. I have some practical things, though, that we can do. Some 4 practical suggestions here. What we can do to help encourage social justice. What we can do to help those that are outnumbered and need our help, need someone to stand up for them. The first thing we can do is to call out racism for what it is. We cannot simply let racist comments, racist remarks, racist people slide because, well, I don't want to make a big deal out of it. We cannot simply stand by and say, well, okay, yeah, that sounds bad, but I don't know the full story. I'll wait till I hear both sides of the story before I say anything. When we do that, what usually happens is we never hear the other side of the story and we just forget about it and we move on. And we end up, in essence, condoning these racist things that were said or done. So it doesn't matter if these racist words come out of politicians at the highest levels. It doesn't matter if these racist words come out of the mouths of celebrities or come out of the mouths or are performed in actions by even church leaders themselves. We have to call it out. We have to condemn it, and we have to turn from it. We can't just excuse it away and say, well, it's no big deal because that politician is a member of my party. Or that actor was the star of my favorite movie. Or that religious leader is part of my denomination. We have to call out racism where and when we see it. The second thing we can do is to vote for minorities, to vote for people that do not look like us. On a national level, there are 9 minority senators. That's 9%. There's 100 senators. There's 9% of our Senate representatives are minorities, while 40% of our population is Black or Hispanic or Asian. The representation ratio is way off base here. And when it comes to a local level, Tracy is an ever increasingly diverse town. And it's good. It's a good thing. But we should do what we can to ensure that the leadership of Tracy reflects that diversity. So that might mean voting for a qualified candidate that perhaps doesn't look like you, that doesn't have your same skin color or your same ethnic background, so that they can help represent their community better in terms of the larger community. The third thing that we can do is to not minimize problems. And this might be the most tricky, most touchy suggestion that I have this morning. In fact, my palms are starting to sweat a little bit. But we cannot minimize the problems that other groups are saying they are experiencing because we haven't experienced them. I have noticed that, I think throughout history, but in particular recent history, that whenever there has been a group, whenever there has been a movement of people that are trying to shine a light onto the problems of their community, there almost instantaneously seems to arise another group that tries to minimize and to downplay the problems that are trying to be addressed. We see this in the Me Too movement. We see this in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know for some of us, perhaps, even those words, Black Lives Matter, are like nails on a chalkboard. But the thing is, the truth is, there's a reason why these movements have been necessary. Sure, they're not perfect. I know that there have been some things that have happened in the Black Lives Matter movement that haven't been good. But there's a reason why it's gotten to this point where a movement like that has been needed and has been necessary. And for us to go along and say, no, that's not right. I don't, that's not for me. That's wrong. That's to minimize what they're trying to talk about. That's to minimize the problems they're trying to address. And when we respond to things like Black Lives Matter with statements like all lives matter, which is true, white lives matter, Hispanic lives matter, Asian lives matter. But when we respond to that by saying, you know what? We're just basically saying, just quiet down. We don't need to hear what you're saying because all lives matter. And that minimizes the problem. In fact, I actually found a cartoon that really helped me understand this better. And this is the cartoon. It says, well, I think that all lives matter. We should care exactly equally at all times about everything. All houses matter. This is not to say that one house is more valuable than the other house. It is saying that at times when a house is on fire, when there are flames shooting out the windows, that house needs more attention than the other houses that aren't on fire. To say that Black lives matter does not mean that white lives matter. We all know that white lives matter. The problem is that society has not treated Black lives with the same value that they have treated white lives. And we see this play out too in the Me Too movement, where women say, this has been problematic. We've been sexually assaulted. We've been sexually harassed. And almost immediately we hear men say, well, what about false accusations? What about those good guys? What if women lie about the good guys? We can't listen to all women. We can't really believe all women. And while that might be true, while there might be one or two women here or there that come up with some false statements, man, if we use that to not listen to the rest of women who say they have had serious problems in our society, that does not reflect well on who we are. And that does nothing to help improve the health of our society at large. And the fourth and final practical thing I think we can do is to seek out conversations, is to talk with the people we know that might be in these minority groups, to go and have a conversation with our Black coworker, get their feedback, get their perspective, go talk with our female neighbor and see what they've gone through. Go and have conversations with people to help us understand things better. And if you don't have people in your life from these outnumbered groups, from these underpowered groups, go and seek them out. Don't wait for them to come to you. Go and have conversations. Initiate the conversations. Don't have to wait for someone to stumble through your door or to call you up randomly. Go be proactive. And sure that you might stumble, you might say a wrong word, you might express a wrong idea here or there, but when you're trying to have a genuine conversation, you'll be amazed at how understanding and how lenient these other groups can be when you're there trying to engage in a genuine conversation. And when we do these things, when we take these things seriously, we begin to see things through God's eyes. And then humanity becomes much more connected than we first realized. See, this is what Paul is trying to get across to the Christians there in Galatia. He says, in Christ, there is no difference between Jew and Greek, slave and free person, male and female. You are all the same in Christ Jesus. He is saying that Jesus breaks down all of those barriers that say that we're in this group and you're in that group. They're not with Jesus. He says with Jesus, you see everyone as connected, that there is no majority, there is no minority, there is no in power and out of power. There is just us, children of God. So in closing, let's dream together again, just for a moment. What would it look like if every Christian, if every follower of God took these words of Obadiah and Paul seriously? What would it look like if Christians were known for being welcoming and supportive than for being judgmental and exclusionary? What would the world look like if Christian churches were known for being safe places for everyone, regardless of what they looked like or what they believed, so that when they were experiencing harassment and abuse and hurt at the hands of the world, they would know that once they stepped foot through our doors, they would find comfort and support? What would the world look like if your Muslim neighbor and your female coworker and your LGBTQ cousin and your Hispanic employee knew that you were Christian, and that Tyler, he believes some funny things, but he has always had my back? What would the world look like then? I can tell you the world would be a much better place than it is now, because Christians would be truly reflecting the love and the character of God to everyone. This morning, we have been challenged by the words of Obadiah. God is calling us to stand up for those who are outnumbered. He is calling us to speak out for those who are underpowered. He is calling us to make the world a better place. Obadiah says that we cannot simply stand by and remain silent. We have to act. And it's challenging for me because I know that it's going to be costly. But I want to respond to God's challenge this morning, even though I know it means voluntarily leaving that place of power and the majority and siding with those that are outnumbered and powerless. I want to respond to this call from God this morning. Will you respond to the call? This morning, do you accept God's challenge to speak out for those who are outnumbered and underpowered? Praise God.